Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. It's been kind of cold where I live, so I have been really bundled up lately. So, just to give you an example, right now, I've got the heat on in my house, but I'm so cold-natured. I have, a blanket over me right now. If it were socially acceptable to wear a blanket out in public, I probably would. Or, I could wear a poncho. That's basically the same thing. You just cut a hole in it for your head. So, yeah, I'm all bundled up here. I've got my hot chocolate. I'm ready to go. And I don't know. Does it blow anyone else's mind that we're, halfway through November? And I don't know, if you're anything like me, I love the holidays, but they also simultaneously stress me out. So I hope you guys are able to get through the holidays as stress-free as possible. So on today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Sky Phantom, which is the 53rd book in the Nancy Drew series. And it came out in 1976. I don't know, reading some of the years that these books were published and released, I'm oh, we're getting real close to the 80s, the 90s. I'm excited to see what's in store for Nancy Drew later on in the series. So as always, I love to discuss the different covers for the books, and I was able to find 2 separate covers for the Sky Phantom. If you ever want to see these covers before the episode airs, I post these on my Instagram on Wednesdays, and my Instagram is True Drew Podcast. I also like to just post a lot of funny Nancy Drew stuff over there. So the first edition of this cover is one that most people I think would be familiar with, but this is the yellow spine flashlight edition. And we have Nancy sitting at the controls with, I guess this is Bruce, the guy who's teaching her to fly in this book. Oh yeah, I should probably mention Nancy's in the cockpit of a plane. A little bit of context there, but there's all these controls over the manifold in front of her, and she's got the wheel, the stick. I don't know. I don't fly a plane, so I don't know what it's called. But she is looking out the windshield of the front of the plane, and there's this black shadowy figure walking towards her, and he always to me looked like he had a bit of a cowlick, his hair looks kind of interesting, but even so, it's a man where he shouldn't be. He's walking through the clouds, it's eerie looking. Even despite the spookiness of this cover, though, Nancy's looking pretty fly. She's got a button-down shirt on, or I think it is. She has her back to us, the viewer, but she's got the red strawberry blonde hair. It's curled at the ends, and she's wearing aviators. I don't know. I just feel like she's really very Top Gun on this cover. I want to start singing the theme song from Top Gun just looking at this. Nancy's gonna fly into the danger zone. Gosh, I'm so stupid. Okay, anyway, enough of that. Now, the next edition of this cover, this has got to be a foreign edition. I don't know if it's a UK edition or what it is, but we've got Nancy and Bruce. Bruce is wearing a tie. He looks like the pilots that I've seen when I go on a trip and get on a plane. Nancy's got almost 80s beach waved hair, and then there's all this lightning going around the plane, and then the Phantom is more of this big blue and white looking person. I don't know. It's a very interesting cover. I'll give it that. But I did give it a funny cover spoof, and actually I think this could apply to either of the covers, and I just said the mystery of the big creepy guy in the sky, because that kind of just sums it up. But I gave both these covers a 3 magnifying glass rating. I kind of tend to favor the first one because that's what I grew up with, but they're pretty decent covers. Now let's go ahead and jump into discussing some of the characters we see in the Sky Phantom. Now, I already mentioned Bruce, but Bruce Fisher is the flight instructor pictured on the cover. He teaches Nancy how to fly a plane. There's Roger Payne, who is a missing pilot, and that's kind of the center of this entire mystery. And there's a Mr. Falcon, who is the flying school manager. I just love that his name is Mr. Falcon. Good job, sir. You couldn't have gone into a better line of work. There's also Pop Hamilton. I almost couldn't read my handwriting. I thought I said Pop Hammy Han. I was like, that makes no sense. Pop Hamilton is the owner of a ranch that Nancy, Bess, and George are staying at. There's also Hal Calkin, who is the instructor who talks in run-on sentences, and Chuck and Range Cooper, they are cowboys on Mr. Hamilton's ranch. Howard Stanton, who is a government agent, and Ben Rawl, who is just, I put mean cowboy in parentheses. I love that I give myself these notes, just mean cowboy, government agent. Like, most of them make sense, but if it's been a minute since I've read the book before I do the episode, I'm like, wait, what? What did I mean by that? So now really quickly, to give you a feel for this mystery, I'll go ahead and read the synopsis that I came up with. Nancy, Bess, and George are on vacation at Hamilton Ranch where Nancy is learning to fly planes. Nancy hears from people at the aviation school that there is a mysterious cloud in the sky that planes often go missing in. Nancy and her instructor, Bruce, investigate a crashed plane, but find no pilot at the crash site. Roger Payne is the missing pilot, and Nancy sets out to find him, uncovering villainous plots and bombs along the way. Bess falls in love with a cowboy, Nancy strikes oil, and many more things happen in this mystery. And the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with to sum it all up is Weapons Plot Uncovered Near Mysterious Cloud. Okay, so without further ado, let's jump into some of the direct quotes and notes that I took down for the Sky Phantom. So the first thing that I wrote down is Nancy is taking flight lessons. What can't this girl do? Like, she does everything. It's honestly really impressive. And it gives me a bit of an inferiority complex, but I'll save that for my therapist. I also think it's neat, although Mildred Wirt Benson did not write the plot of this book. The last book that she wrote, I believe, was The Clue of the Velvet Mask. Even though she had no hand in this book, I think it's cool that Nancy learns to fly because Mildred Wirt Benson herself learned to fly planes later in life, which is just so cool. Honestly, I kind of want to say that I aspire to be Mildred Wirt Benson. I mean, what an awesome just tagline or bio would she have had if she had been around for Instagram? It would have been like author, journalist, pilot, and who knows what else, like explorer. She did everything. So Bruce, who is Nancy's flight instructor, says there's a mystery cloud that's always in the area. So this is the cloud that we see on the cover of the book with the spooky Sky Phantom. And there's just a lot of weird things going on with it. It kind of seems like the Bermuda Triangle because planes just go missing in it. So at the beginning of this book, Nancy is flying with Bruce and they're going through some flight maneuvers, and she sees Bess and George signaling to her on horseback below, and Nancy and Bruce are kind of trying to figure out, like, what are they trying to tell us? And they fly a little bit further and they find a crashed plane with no pilot. So Bruce makes a call about the plane, and it turns out that it's registered to someone named Roger Payne, and the plane was actually under the suspicious cloud. So Nancy's kind of like, did he lose control of the plane? Does that cloud make the instruments on the plane go crazy? We don't know. Also, the book leads you to believe like this cloud is pretty much in the same area all the time, which is kind of weird and not a natural phenomenon that I've ever heard of. But like, you know, clouds, they move around. They don't stay stationary in one place. So that in itself is suspicious. So when Nancy and Bruce get back to the aviation school, a few people there say they'll conduct a search and look for Roger. And Bruce asks if Nancy can help, and he says she's an amateur detective, but only because she won't accept money for her work. See, like everybody around Nancy is aware of this. They're like, Nancy, if you would just accept money for your work, you could be like a senior detective or a master sleuth. But no, you're just an amateur detective, a very good one. But you got to start accepting money for what you're worth. So it's at this point when Nancy and Bruce conduct a ground search, and they go back to the scene of where the plane was, and now the plane is just mysteriously gone. And they see boot marks and wheel marks where the plane was. So somebody came and got this plane. Was it Roger? Was it someone else? We will find out. So next, Nancy goes back to Hamilton Ranch, and Major, a horse there, goes missing. And apparently the dogs didn't bark and the horse was locked up, so Nancy thinks someone at the ranch could have stolen it. I mean, that's pretty solid reasoning. The dogs wouldn't have barked at one of the ranch hands because they see them every day. They're familiar to them, and any one of the men who works on the ranch would have a key and could have unlocked the horse's stall. So now the real question is, who did it? Who took Major? I have a strong suspicion that it's going to be a very unlikable character who scowls at Nancy in strange ways. So the next note that I wrote down is Nancy, Bess, and George go on a picnic and find a parachute. and Bess is scared someone might be lying under it, and George teases her saying, "There's a dinosaur." I mean, Bess's fears aren't completely unfounded, like, it could be somebody lying there, but usually, like, if someone's lying there, like, presumably dead, like, their parachute wouldn't have gone off, or maybe it went off and it had a hole in it, I don't know. But it's so funny to me how George will just tease Bess about these fears. She's just like, she'll throw out some of the most ridiculous things sometimes. Also, for the record, there was nobody under the parachute. It's just a parachute. So the next thing that I took note of is some guy named Chuck Chase has been flirting with Bess. He wins a rodeo roping contest and he tosses his sombrero to Bess. So Bess has a thing for cowboys. But it's funny to me how Bess will get on to Nancy, like in the Clue in the Old Stagecoach. She'll be like, "Nancy, you shouldn't be flirting with Rick Larrabee because it'll hurt Ned's feelings." And then it's like, Bess, what are you doing right now? You are hurting Dave's feelings because here you are flirting with this cowboy at a rodeo. Double standards. And even though I'm saying that, I also at the same time can't help but imagine an alternate universe where Bess ends up with this guy named Chuck and just goes and lives out her life on a ranch. Like, I would read those books. I'm just saying. Bess Marvin gives off that main character energy. So Nancy, Bess, and George watch some flight videos, and Nancy sees a larger unidentified plane disappear in the mystery cloud, and it never comes out. So she's trying to figure out, like, why is this cloud here? What is the significance? Where is Roger Payne? Like, it's kind of a convoluted mystery in some ways, but it all centers around this cloud. Also, this cloud has to be huge. I mean, just the fact that a plane can go in it and turn around and fly around within it for hours and hours on end and nobody sees it, like, how big is this thing? So Pop Hamilton, the guy who owns the ranch, tells Nancy he received a threatening phone call from a stranger telling Nancy not to interfere with his plans. I mean, we are on the 53rd book, guys. Like, do the villains not realize, like, a threatening phone call means nothing to Nancy Drew? She's going to ignore it. She's going to keep doing what she's doing. Like, they should get a new shtick. So the next note that I wrote down is on another flying lesson, Nancy sees a horse she thinks might be Major, but it's not. And so she and Bruce touch down to confirm. They're like, maybe it's Major. They get out of the plane to go check it out. But they meet a government agent named Howard Stanton who says several horses have gone missing in the area. So this kind of reminded me of the sheep going missing and the Clue of the Whistling Bagpipes. So I was like, oh, okay, so we have a mysterious cloud. We have horses going missing. All these things are maybe going to tie up in the end. We'll see. Okay, so you remember how I said I had strong suspicions that whoever took the horse off of the ranch was most likely someone who glares at Nancy and is mean to her? Well, Ben Rawl, who is quote-unquote the mean cowboy that I listed in the characters earlier, he saddles up a horse for Nancy and it rears and tries to buck her off, and Pop fires him, and Ben threatens to get even with Nancy. Dun dun dun! And then he also steals $100 from the other cowboys as a parting gift. Like, he's not a good guy. And then literally, what did I just tell you? So the next thing I wrote down, Ben Rawl tries to push a huge log at Nancy, Bess, and George on their trail ride. Like, they're just out enjoying their life. They're on a hike on these horses. And he's just like, I'm going to cause some mischief, and shoves a big tree at him. But thankfully, they're able to avoid it, and then everyone sees Roger Payne's plane is gone. But Nancy finds a medallion with his initials on it. And then they find Major, the horse. So 1 out of 2 is not bad. We found the horse. Now we just have to find this plane. So the next thing that I wrote down is George flirts with Range, this other cowboy on the ranch, and Bess flirts with Chuck. Looks like Nancy isn't the only one with a cheating heart. I mean, this is the second time I've mentioned it. This clearly made an impression on me, but I think it's funny how Bess and George are allowed to, date other people. But then Nancy, they're like, no, Nancy, you can't hurt Ned's feelings. But I don't know. It's like, it's a weird double standard. I don't know. It just seems like a strange dating culture of that time. We talked about this in the Clue in the Old Stagecoach episode already. But I just feel like if you like someone, you would spend time with them. You wouldn't be over here spending time with these other people. So everyone's out on this trail ride and they get their sleeping bags out for the night. And in the middle of the night, a guy in a sombrero tries to steal one of their horses and he succeeds. The horse bandits strike again. But then the guy in the sombrero also shoots one of the horses, which is apparently named Speed Boy, in the leg, which is so upsetting. So then Pop Hamilton gives the horse a eulogy and shoots it. I mean, I know Speed Boy wasn't going to be able to walk again, but this was so traumatizing. It reminded me of that scene in Water for Elephants when they have to shoot the circus pony, and I was just like, oh gosh, I was not prepared to deal with this level of emotion. It's just so sad. But then Range, one of the cowboys, comes back with the stolen pony, so he was able to get it away from Sombrero Man. Speed Boy did not die in vain. Okay, on to the less traumatizing parts of this book. The girls decide to start trying to translate the markings on the medallion that they found, and it says Revolution Bomb Site, and then they also decode the word under. I mean, this medallion was found outside of Roger Payne's plane. Like, do we even want to find Roger? Is he a nice guy? Is he involved in this plot of bombs and revolutions? Like, maybe it's better that we don't find him. So Nancy goes for another flying lesson, and she and Bruce see Roger Payne's plane go into the big mysterious cloud. So they follow him into it, and they see a dark, shadowy giant like the one we saw on the cover of the book, and then what looks like a lion. This part was so weird. I was like, what do you mean, a lion? But then I was like, it's a Nancy Drew book. We're just going to go with it. But their flight navigation panel also goes out, and Nancy thinks they won't make it. So it's like this big, mysterious cloud has some kind of magnetic sort of properties to it because it upsets plane apparatus and stuff, but they're finally able to get out, and they're able to land the plane and not crash it, and that was just too intense for me. I don't even know if I would be able to take flying lessons like Nancy. Like, that's too much responsibility. I'm good with just a car. So the next note that I took down is there's going to be a masquerade dance, and Bess says she'll go as a gypsy. George is going to be a clown, appropriate, and Nancy says she'll be a blithe spirit. So I looked this up because I've heard the word blithe before, but according to Google, it just means glad, cheerful, joyous. So she's just a happy spirit. What, Nancy? All the good costumes were taken? I don't know. I feel like Nancy Drew is the type of person that would love a good pun. Like, she would dress up like one time for Halloween, I dressed up as a cat burglar, and I wore all black, and I had like cat beanie babies around my waist on a belt. I don't know. I thought it was funny. Or I once saw somebody dress up with a FedEx t-shirt and a tutu, and they were a mail order bride. Hilarious. Like, Blythe Spirit is not making the costume while at Party City, if you know what I mean. Oh my gosh, I probably just dated myself so much by saying that. So anyways, then Ned, Bert, and Dave say they're coming to visit, and Dave is so sweet and says he's counting the minutes until he sees Bess. And Bess just stammers something back to him, and when they hang up, she tells Nancy and George she may be in love with Chuck. And then Bess accompanies this with some crying and throws herself down on the bed, and George, of course, snaps at Bess and tells her to get it together. And Bess drops the bombshell that Chuck asked her to marry him. So then, of course, George has nothing to say to this because she's not the most empathetic person. I feel like she's not like the type of person to give advice. So she just like leaves the room, and then Nancy's advice to Bess, she's just like calming her down, and she's like, it's okay, honey, and like rubbing her back, and she's like, you should compare Chuck and Dave. And she says, Dave is more Eastern and Chuck is more Western. Like, I get what Nancy was saying. She was like, with Dave, it'll be more, picnics and barbecues. And with Chuck, it will be more like lassoing horses and, going out on the wild, wild prairie or something. But I think Bess should base her decision more on their actual personality traits, like call me crazy, like not where they're from, like maybe just how she feels about them. But it's very apparent from this scene, like Bess doesn't know. She's torn in both directions. So Nancy, Bess, and George go to the masquerade, and this guy in a sailor costume asks Nancy to dance and tries to lead her outside. So she feels really uncomfortable with this, and she rips off his mask, and it's Ben Rawl. and everyone chases him off. He said he was going to get even with Nancy, so it's really creepy that he snuck into the masquerade and tried to cause problems. So the next note that I have down is Nancy and Bruce fly to a different area and they meet a guy named John Wade. Like, I'm sorry, you can't tell me that's not a play off of John Wayne. It was like this other book where they had a character named Walt Frisbee. I think it was the guy in Secret of the Wooden Lady. I think the guy who made the figureheads. Walt Frisbee, Walt Disney, John Wade, John Wayne. Like, that's not a coincidence. But anyways, in typical John Wade / John Wayne fashion, he's out there looking for oil. The next thing that I took note of is Nancy translates the rest of the message on the back of the medallion. She has revolution, bomb, sight, and under, but then she translates the last two words as great cloud. So revolution, bomb sight, under great cloud. The plot thickens. So it's after this that John Wade's pony runs off. So he and Bruce get in the plane and go after it. They're trying to figure out where it went. So while they're gone, Nancy just gets bored and decides to explore a cave. You know, as one does. I don't know, I might explore a cave, but if there's water in the cave, I'm not going. I've gone down that YouTube rabbit hole. I'm not spelunking. But then a literal wave of mice comes running after Nancy while she's in the cave, and there's oil dripping down from the ceiling all over her. So I'm just picturing her covered in oil, and then these mice just like, and just like chasing her, and it's just like, oh, that's no, not my idea of a good time. But then Nancy is trying to go up these like stone steps that go out of the cave. I guess they're natural, or I don't think they're man-made, but she keeps slipping and falling. She can't get any traction, so she ends up having to take off her sweater to soak up the oil on the rocks and then climb the slippery steps, like basically by crawling up them, which I'm like, I'm sure the mice are just still like running everywhere around her and just crawling all over her, just like, ugh. No. So then, as if that experience is not just horrible enough, Nancy and Bruce have to make a crash landing when the plane engine quits. So they're able to fix it in the nick of time, and they continue flying on, and they see John Wade and his pony just laying out in the middle of the desert unconscious. So they land the plane and decide to help them, and when John Wade comes to consciousness, Nancy tells him about the oil, which, you know, that was pretty nice of her because technically she discovered it. I'm just, you know, like, I mean, Nancy, if you're not going to accept money for solving mysteries, you should at least get rich off oil. So meanwhile, Bess, George, Chuck, and Range went for a picnic and a ride, and Ben Rawl shows up, of course, because he's horrible, and he gives them a note and a message to stop snooping. So he then denies stealing the money earlier, and George opens the note, and it's a ransom note from Roger Payne saying he has to hand over his plane and $4,000 or he'll be killed. So I looked that up. That would be roughly $22,000 today, and Nancy later remarks that that's a low amount for a ransom, and I was thinking the same thing. I was like, that doesn't sound enough for a man's life. I know, like at least 50,000 something. I don't know. I don't think like a villain. The next note that I wrote down is Bess says she had a dream about Dave and Chuck and they killed each other in a duel. And then at dinner, she isn't very hungry. So this just kind of shows us where Bess is mentally. She's still trying to decide between Dave and Chuck, and it's creeping into her dreams, and it's affecting her appetite, and it's just really sad. So it's at this point in the book when Ben Rawl gets captured, and Pop Hamilton catches him and ties him up. But Nancy, Bess, and George are there when this happens, and Ben Rawl is like muttering under his breath, and he's like, I hate cowgirls. Well, Ben, if your dance card for the masquerade is any indication, the cowgirls don't like you either. So this next thing, I had to make a note of it because, of course, George and Bess are flirting with Range and Chuck, and Nancy is not flirting with anyone in this book. But she sees George with Range and Bess with Chuck, and the book says she felt lonely and wished Ned were there, or even Bruce. Like, dang, Nancy, that's cold. Like, are Ned and Bruce just like interchangeable in your mind? Like, this was so weird to me. I was like, what a strange comment. for you to make or a thought for you to have, Nancy. I mean, I get being lonely within reason, but still. But this next moment was kind of sweet. I don't know if Nancy deserved it, but when Ned, Bert, and Dave's plane lands, it says Ned sweeps Nancy up and kisses her. So Nancy tells Ned about her flying lessons, and he says he can't wait to see the way she manipulates the stick. I can't. My mind went there. It made me laugh. So the next note that I took down is Pop tells everybody that he sent Chuck and Range off on an assignment. And I was like, this man knows what's up. Like, he may just be like the owner of this ranch, but he knows. He's not blind. He's seen Range flirting with George and Chuck flirting with Bess, and he knew that, Bert and Dave were coming to town. So it's so funny to me how these side characters will just do this. They'll be like, oh yeah, I just, made all your problems go away for you. You're welcome. So Dave thinks that Chuck put nettles in his bed, like little thorns or something. And Nancy overhears some guy named Stevie, who's never been mentioned up to this point. He's just this random guy. And he says he did it and he hates guys from the coast. Dang, it's a regular Wild Wild West Side story. It's just like we got the guys on the coast and we got the cowboys and they're just gonna like duke it out or something. I'm like, oh my gosh. So anyways, Nancy and Bruce have Ned come along with them for one of their flying lessons, and it turns out Ned knows how to fly too. He was not telling Nancy that he'd been learning. He wanted to surprise her, so that's kind of cool. But they go out to the site of that weird magnetic cloud thing, and Nancy and Ned find boxes of rifles and diffused bombs buried under the cloud. It's all starting to make sense now. So Nancy and Ned find Roger Payne, but then someone puts bags over their heads and they almost suffocate. They're able to get themselves out of that situation, but it turns out the medallion that they found it belonged to someone named Rudolph Panzer, who has the same initials as Roger Payne. So it wasn't even Roger Payne's. It's just this other guy named Rudolph. And so they catch him. I don't know what Rudolph's problem was. I don't know if they let him play any of their flying planes games or whatever, but he was just like, I'm gonna go commit violence today and I'm gonna have all these bombs and start a revolution. I mean, if my parents named me Rudolph, I don't know. I might be doing something very different today. But apparently Rudolph was throwing magnetized dust in the cloud. Like, this made no sense to me, but that's like, we're supposed to believe that that's what explains the shape of the lion, the shadowy figure, the fact that this cloud never moves. It's always in the same place. Like, that's not enough for me. I'm going to need a little bit more than that. It's like Nancy's hand getting stuck to that wall in the glowing eye mystery. Like, I just still don't. It doesn't make sense. And the last note that I wrote down is Bess says she chose Dave. He's her quote-unquote favorite boyfriend. She doesn't really explain why, but I am happy with that because I was really sad. I was thinking, no, Bess is going to go live home on the range, and I couldn't handle that. So for the next segment in the podcast, I like to call this What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen. This segment has kind of evolved into just what's cooking in general, like whoever is making food in the book. But we got mentionings of bacon and biscuits, ham and cheese sandwiches, coleslaw, angel food cake and milk, and then another meal that they had was soup, rolls, roast beef, salad, and blueberry pie. Now, this next segment is something that I like to call Add That to Your Resume, and I said Nancy could call herself a professional pilot. She took a lot of flying lessons. She, diverted the plane from crashing several times, and she's an oil prospector. She found oil on accident. Now let's talk about the things I liked and the things I didn't like about the Sky Phantom. So honestly, I was here for the Bess Chuck Dave drama. That was very interesting. I loved it. I like when they bring in these different aspects of the characters' relationships, and yes, chef's kiss. I also really like the fact that Nancy was learning to fly and become a pilot in this book. That was really, really cool. And I love the ranch setting. I love whenever Nancy's on a ranch. And the things I didn't like, that weird cloud, like it just made no sense to me. Like, I know some things don't have to make sense, but and really that's a lot of the things that don't make sense are in Nancy Drew books, but I'm just like, So as far as a magnifying glass rating goes for the Sky Phantom, I gave it 3 magnifying glasses. It wasn't a horrible book. It wasn't the best book. I think that the Bess, Dave, Chuck love triangle definitely spiced things up, but there were just a few things lacking for me. So yeah, that concludes today's episode for the Sky Phantom. For next week's episode, we're going to be talking about the strange message in the parchment. So if you like books where sheep get slaughtered, no, really, that happens in this book. And if you like strange messages and artwork, then you will definitely like this book. Until next time, thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.